May 1, 1945. The waters off Sakishima Gunto, a chain of rocky island airstrips the Japanese used as staging posts for their relentless Kamikaze campaign against the Allied fleet closing on Okinawa. Aboard HMS Formidable, American liaison officers stood on the bridge wing watching the sky with the particular stillness of men who already knew how this ended. They had been attached to the British Pacific Fleet for several weeks by this point, and they had accumulated a growing sense of unease that had nothing to do with fear of the enemy. It had to do with something they couldn't quite explain. But what was coming at 1707 hours on that afternoon would crystallize everything into a single, unforgettable image. The Zero appeared out of the haze in a shallow dive, descending at approximately 300 miles per hour with a 550-pound bomb fused beneath its fuselage. The American officers braced instinctively. They had seen this before. On USS Bunker Hill, struck by two kamikazes off Okinawa just days earlier, the fires had burned for hours, the casualties had exceeded 400 killed and wounded, and the ship had been effectively removed from the war. On USS Franklin, a single bomb had triggered a catastrophe so total that 807 men died in one morning and the ship never fought again. The Americans on Formidable's bridge knew the arithmetic of this moment. They had lived it. The Zero hit the flight deck at the base of the island superstructure. The explosion was enormous. Smoke billowed across the deck. Burning aviation fuel spread in a brief, terrible sheet. And then, 37 minutes later, HMS Formidable was conducting flying operations. The crater in the armored flight deck measured roughly 24 feet by 20 feet and was pressed approximately 2 feet into the steel. 11 men were killed and 47 wounded, figures that represented genuine tragedy and were mourned as such. But the ship herself was operational. The arrestor wires were re-rigged. Aircraft began landing. One of the American liaison officers, watching this with an expression that witnesses later described as somewhere between admiration and bafflement, reportedly removed his cap, stared at it for a moment, and said nothing at all. The remark that entered naval history came from a different officer on a different ship on a different day, but it captured the same bewilderment. When a kamikaze hits a United States carrier, it is 6 months' repair in a dockyard. When a kamikaze hits a British carrier, it is a case of sweepers, man your brooms. The question of why required an answer that reached back not to the Pacific War at all, but to a series of design decisions made in London in the mid-1930s, driven largely by one man whose name is rarely spoken outside specialist circles but whose engineering instincts saved hundreds, perhaps thousands, of lives before the decade of the 1940s was finished. Stanley Goodall became Director of Naval Construction for the Royal Navy in 1936, inheriting a fleet modernization program constrained by treaty limitations, stretched budgets, and the particular strategic geography of the British Empire. Britain's carriers would fight within range of land-based aircraft across multiple theaters. The Mediterranean, the Indian Ocean, the waters around Malaya, everywhere the Royal Navy operated, shore-based bombers and fighters could reach the fleet. The Americans, planning for a Pacific campaign of vast open distances, designed their carriers to maximize striking power, enormous open hangars, large air groups, high speed. The assumption built into American carrier design was that fighter cover and anti-aircraft fire would keep the enemy away from the ship. If that failed, damage control would limit the consequences. Goodall looked at the same problem and reached a different conclusion. He believed that in the kind of congested, shore-based aircraft-heavy environments the Royal Navy would inevitably face, hits were not a question of if but when. The ship had to survive the hit. The design philosophy he drove through the Admiralty, against considerable resistance from officers who wanted larger air groups and resented the weight penalties, was the armored carrier. The flight deck itself would be constructed of 3 inches of hardened cemented steel armor. The hangar would be enclosed, its sides armored, creating what naval architects called an armored box. Ammunition lifts would be designed to prevent fire traveling between decks. Aviation fuel systems would be pressurized with carbon dioxide to suppress ignition. Every system would assume the worst and engineer against it. The weight cost was severe. The Illustrious class, the first carriers built to this philosophy, carried approximately 36 aircraft compared to the American Essex class's complement of 90 or more. Goodall's ships were slower to build, more expensive per ton, and operationally less powerful in the offensive sense. He knew this. He accepted it. He died in 1965, having seen the doctrine he championed tested in one of the most violent sustained aerial campaigns in naval history, and the results of that test constituted one of the most complete validations of an engineering philosophy in the entire history of warfare. The first serious test came not in the Pacific but in the Mediterranean, and it came earlier than anyone expected. On January 10, 1941, HMS Illustrious was operating in support of a Malta convoy when she was attacked by approximately 40 Junkers Ju-88 and Stuka dive bombers of Fliegerkorps X, the Luftwaffe's specialist anti-shipping unit, arguably the finest such formation in the world at that moment. 6 bombs struck Illustrious directly. A 7th hit the ship's lift. She was set on fire. Her steering was damaged. She listed. By every conventional assessment of the era, a carrier absorbing 6 direct bomb hits from professional anti-shipping aircraft should have been sunk, or reduced to a burning, unmanageable wreck within the hour. Instead, Illustrious made Alexandria under her own power. The armored deck had initiated several of the bombs before they penetrated to the hangar, containing the blasts within what the design had intended as a sacrificial zone above the armored box. The fires, while serious, were contained rather than catastrophic. 126 men died, a grievous toll, recorded and mourned, but the ship survived. She required repairs, substantial ones, eventually conducted in the United States. But she returned to service. She fought again. Fliegerkorps X, reporting back to Berlin, expressed what amounted to professional bewilderment. Their assessment was that a ship of that class should not have survived that attack. The armor had, in the blunt language of the after-action reports, changed the physics of the encounter. By the time the British Pacific Fleet arrived in the waters around Okinawa in the spring of 1945, this was an established pattern rather than a lucky exception. HMS Indefatigable was struck by a kamikaze on April 1, 1945 at 0720 hours. The aircraft hit the base of the island structure, its bomb detonating on the armored deck. 14 men were killed and 16 wounded. At 0816 hours, 56 minutes after impact, Indefatigable was conducting flying operations. An American officer observing the recovery reportedly asked a British counterpart how long the ship would be out of action. The British officer looked at him with mild confusion and said she was not out of action. The American, by multiple accounts, had no immediate response to this. 4 days later, on May 4th, HMS Formidable sustained her first kamikaze strike of the campaign, a hit that punched a depression into the armored deck, started fires in the hangar, destroyed or damaged 11 aircraft, killed 8 men and wounded 47. She was back in full operation within an hour. The same day, HMS Indomitable, operating nearby, was also struck and returned to flight operations within the afternoon. On May 9th, Formidable was hit again, this time taking a second kamikaze that compounded the deck damage from the earlier strike, killing 1 man and wounding 7. She was reduced temporarily to reduced operations, then restored to full capability within 2 days without dockyard assistance. The flight deck was repaired using a mixture of steel plate and quick-setting concrete that British damage control parties had learned to carry specifically for this contingency, the kind of practical adaptation that only emerges from a doctrine built around the expectation of being hit and continuing to fight. HMS Victorious was struck on May 9, 1945 as well, a kamikaze impact that left a 24 by 20-foot depression in the armored deck but caused no penetration to the hangar below. She was conducting operations within 40 minutes. An official United States Navy report produced after Okinawa noted, with the particular careful language of official assessments masking what must have been genuine astonishment, that British carriers demonstrated a markedly superior ability to absorb damage and return to operations compared to their American counterparts engaged in similar operations. Samuel Eliot Morison, the official United States naval historian who observed operations at Okinawa, provided what became the most quoted summary of this contrast. His observation, that a kamikaze hit on an American carrier produced a repair period measured in months, while the same hit on a British carrier produced a call for the sweepers, compressed the complex engineering reality into a phrase that naval historians have repeated ever since because it is, beneath its wit, entirely accurate. The numbers tell a story that wit alone cannot fully capture. Across the kamikaze campaign at Okinawa and in the waters around Sakishima-gunto, British carriers were struck by 5 kamikaze aircraft that achieved direct hits on flight decks. The average number of men killed per successful kamikaze impact on a British armored carrier was approximately 8. Aircraft losses from each strike averaged between 11 and 15 machines, and operational downtime averaged between 45 minutes and 7 hours before return to flight operations. No British carrier was removed from the campaign by kamikaze damage. Against American carriers in the same campaign, the arithmetic was different in kind rather than merely in degree. USS Bunker Hill, struck by 2 kamikazes on May 11, 1945, suffered 393 killed and wounded and was removed from operations permanently for the remainder of the Pacific War. USS Franklin, struck by a single bomb rather than a kamikaze on March 19, 1945, lost 807 men dead, became the most heavily damaged American carrier to survive the war, and never returned to combat. USS Wasp was struck by a kamikaze on March 19 and required repair time extending weeks. USS Essex, Hancock, and others sustained damage patterns that reflected the fundamental vulnerability of the open hangar design. Fire reaching armed and fueled aircraft in an unarmored space, triggering secondary explosions, cascading into catastrophe. The average death toll from a major kamikaze strike on an American fleet carrier ran between 100 and 400 men. The structural difference between those two sets of numbers is not tactical or operational. It is architectural. The root of the divergence lies in 3 interlocking engineering decisions, each amplifying the effect of the others. The armored flight deck was the most visible, but it was the enclosed armored hangar that most fundamentally changed the damage calculus. American carriers used the hangar as an extension of the flight deck. Aircraft moved through it continuously. It was ventilated to the outside, and its sides were open or lightly constructed to save weight and allow rapid aircraft movement. When a kamikaze penetrated an American flight deck, or when burning fuel and debris cascaded down through an unarmored deck, it entered a space filled with aircraft, ordnance, and fuel in an environment where fire could spread laterally without resistance. The British armored box contained this exact scenario. Hits on the flight deck were initiated or greatly attenuated by the armor before reaching the enclosed hangar space below. Fires that did penetrate were fighting against a sealed, separately ventilated, armored compartment rather than an open continuation of the deck above. The aviation fuel systems represented the second critical difference. British carriers used a pressurized carbon dioxide inert gas system to blanket fuel tanks and piping, significantly reducing the ignition risk from battle damage. American carriers, in the drive to maximize operational tempo and simplify fueling procedures, used systems that left aviation gasoline, an extraordinarily volatile substance at Pacific ambient temperatures, in a state of higher vulnerability to spark or flame ignition. When American carriers burned after kamikaze strikes, they often burned in ways that reflected this, fuel fires spreading through compromised piping systems, reaching places that seemed impossibly remote from the original impact point, defying damage control efforts because the fire was being fed from multiple fractured sources simultaneously. The third factor was operational doctrine built around the physical reality of the ships. British carrier captains, knowing their vessels were designed to absorb hits, operated with a tactical flexibility that armored confidence permitted. They could be tasked to missions of higher risk. Admiral Spruance, commanding the overall American forces at Okinawa, tasked the British Pacific Fleet's carriers specifically with neutralizing the Sakishima Gunto airstrips. A mission requiring sustained operations close to Japanese air power, in part because he calculated correctly that the British ships could absorb the inevitable hits that American carriers in the same position might not survive. Yet here the narrative demands its complicating turn, because the superiority was contextual and carried its own costs. An honest analysis requires stating both. The armored flight deck and enclosed hangar cost the British carriers aircraft. Where an Essex-class carrier could operate 90 to 100 aircraft, the Illustrious class managed 36 and the later Implacable class stretched to approximately 48 under favorable conditions. In pure offensive terms, the ability to project striking power against an enemy fleet or shore installation, the American carriers were substantially more capable. The strategic question of the Pacific War was ultimately decided by offensive power. The ability to sink Japanese carriers, destroy Japanese air power, and support amphibious landings across thousands of miles of ocean. British carriers in the Pacific, for all their tactical survivability, contributed a fraction of the offensive weight of the American fast carrier task forces. They were remarkable defensive achievements operating within an offensive campaign that their design constrained them to support rather than lead. There is also the question of what the armor weighed in the long term. The structural loading imposed by 3 inches of deck armor, distributed across a hull that had been fighting intensively for years, accumulated in ways that post-war surveys made painfully apparent. Formidable was found to have sustained structural distortion from repeated blast loading that made her expensive to repair to peacetime standards. Victorious, Illustrious, and Indomitable were all retired or scrapped within years of the war's end, their hulls worn in ways that reflected the physical reality of having absorbed what they were designed to absorb. The armor had worked. The ships had survived and fought. But the price of that survival was written into their frames, and the post-war Royal Navy, facing financial ruin and a drastically reduced strategic requirement, found that the cost of restoring these battle-worn hulls exceeded the value of keeping them. The Americans, recognizing what Okinawa had demonstrated with unmistakable clarity, incorporated armored flight decks into their carrier designs beginning with the Midway class, commissioned in 1945 and 1947. Every subsequent generation of American fleet carrier, the Forrestal class, the Kitty Hawk class, the nuclear-powered Enterprise and her successors, carried armored flight decks as a baseline design assumption. The lesson that Goodall had encoded into steel in the late 1930s became universal doctrine within a decade. The innovation was absorbed so completely that its origins became invisible, the way truly successful engineering eventually disappears into the assumption of competence rather than remaining visible as a specific achievement. The Japanese naval officers who had studied British carrier operations most carefully, and the Imperial Japanese Navy contained serious, professional analysts who studied their opponents with rigor, understood something about the British carriers that the popular historical narrative rarely surfaces. The psychological dimension of the armored carrier went beyond its physical performance. A weapon designed around the expectation of being hit, and then hit and surviving with almost contemptuous efficiency, communicated something to an enemy whose tactical doctrine was built around the terminal lethality of the kamikaze strike. The kamikaze was a weapon of absolute commitment, a pilot giving his life to destroy a ship. When the ship was not destroyed, when it recovered its aircraft and returned to striking the very airstrips from which the next kamikaze would launch within the same afternoon, the transaction had failed at a level deeper than the tactical. It had failed at the level of meaning. Goodall himself never witnessed the Okinawa campaign that vindicated his philosophy most completely. He lived long enough to see it, retiring in 1944 and surviving until 1965, but the public recognition accorded his design decisions was muted in the way that engineering achievement often is. The thing worked. The catastrophes it prevented are counterfactual. The men it saved never knew they owed their lives to a choice made in an Admiralty office a decade before they were in danger. The 14 men killed on Indefatigable on April 1, 1945 are recorded and real. The 400 who might have died had she been built to a different standard exist only as a statistical inference, and statistical inferences do not receive memorials. HMS Formidable, HMS Indefatigable, HMS Victorious, HMS Indomitable. 4 carriers struck by kamikazes. No carrier sunk. No carrier removed from the campaign by kamikaze damage. Average deaths per hit, 8. Average return to flight operations, under 2 hours. Against these numbers, the American experience at Okinawa, vessels lost, hundreds dead per major strike, months of repair stretching through the remainder of the war, constitutes not a failure of courage or seamanship but a consequence of a design philosophy that optimized for offensive power at the cost of survivability, and paid that cost in full when the enemy found a tactic that bypassed the assumptions on which the design rested. The British armored carrier did not win the Pacific War. It was never designed to. What it was designed to do was absorb the worst the enemy could deliver, keep fighting, and bring its men home. On those terms, measured against the most violent sustained aerial assault on naval vessels in history, it performed with an exactness that its creator could not have dared to predict when he was arguing for 3 inches of hardened steel against colleagues who wanted more aircraft instead. The sweepers manned their brooms. The aircraft landed. The ship sailed on. That is what good engineering looks like when the worst finally arrives.